Love Canal, the neighborhood built on poison. They say there are places in this country that hold secrets so deep, so buried, that the ground itself becomes the lie. Places where the grass is green and the kids ride bikes and the neighbors wave at each other in the morning while something underneath waits. Something that doesn't sleep, doesn't rot, and never asked permission to be there. Love Canal was one of those places, and for years, nobody knew. To understand what happened in Niagara Falls, New York, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to the 1970s when the story finally made the news. Not even to the 1950s when the neighborhood was built. You have to go back to 1942 when a chemical company called Hooker Chemical quietly purchased a stretch of abandoned canal land on the east side of Niagara Falls. It wasn't much to look at, just a wide ditch that had been dug decades earlier and never finished. An eyesore, really. The kind of land nobody wanted, which made it perfect for what Hooker had in mind. Over the next 11 years, Hooker Chemical dumped more than 21,000 tons of toxic chemical waste into that old canal. Drums filled with chlorinated pesticides, dioxins, and over 200 other chemical compounds that, even in small doses, could cause cancer, birth defects, and damage to the nervous system. They buried it all, covered it with clay, and in 1953, they sold the land to the Niagara Falls School Board for exactly $1. $1 and a legal clause buried in the paperwork that said Hooker wasn't responsible for anything that might happen after the sale. The school board built an elementary school right on top of it, and then families moved in. By the late 1950s, Love Canal was a real neighborhood. Ranch houses, backyards, kids playing in the streets after dinner, parents who had worked hard their whole lives to buy something modest and decent and theirs. Nothing fancy, just a place to live, to raise a family, to put down roots. Nobody told them what was underneath those roots. The first signs were easy to explain away. A strange smell in some basements, like chemicals, but faint enough to ignore. Dark-colored puddles that appeared in backyards after heavy rain. Pools that nobody could quite identify. Oily substances that seeped up through the soil in the playground behind the school, leaving stains that the groundskeepers scraped away and didn't report. A rusted drum that broke through the surface of a backyard one summer and had to be quickly removed before anyone asked too many questions. People noticed. But they trusted the city. They trusted the school. They trusted that if something was really wrong, someone in charge would tell them. Nobody told them. Then the children started getting sick. It happened slowly at first, the way these things always do. A higher than normal number of miscarriages on certain blocks, more kids with asthma and headaches and chronic ear infections, a cluster of birth defects that the doctors logged separately in different files, never connecting the dots. Families who'd moved in healthy and started, year by year, to notice that something wasn't right, that they were spending more time in hospitals than their friends in other neighborhoods, that their kids weren't bouncing back the way kids were supposed to, and still, nobody connected it to what was underground. It wasn't a scientist who finally broke it open. It wasn't a government agency or an investigative reporter. It was a 27-year-old housewife named Lois Gibbs who had moved to Love Canal with her husband and 2 young children. Her son Michael started having seizures and recurring infections after starting school at the 99th Street Elementary, the one built directly on top of the dump. Lois requested he be transferred to another school. The district said no, so Lois started knocking on doors. What she found behind those doors changed everything. Neighbor after neighbor with the same story. Sick kids, sick adults, miscarriages, cancers, rare diseases showing up in people who had no family history of them. A woman 3 doors down who had given birth to a baby with 3 ears. A man on the next block whose basement walls wept a black liquid that no plumber could explain. A family who had watched their yard collapse overnight into what turned out to be a buried chemical drum, corroding from the inside. Lois didn't have a science degree. She didn't have political connections. She had a phone, a notebook, and a reason to be angry. She formed the Love Canal Homeowners Association and started making noise. Loud, sustained, impossible to ignore noise. The state finally tested the soil in 1978. What they found was worse than anyone had been willing to admit. Toxic chemicals had leached out of the old canal and spread under the entire neighborhood. They were in the basements, in the groundwater, in the air inside people's homes. Children had been breathing them in at school every single day. The playground, where kids had played for 20 years, was sitting directly above the most contaminated section of the dump. President Carter declared a state of emergency. It was the first time in American history that a natural disaster declaration had been issued for something that wasn't natural at all. They relocated the families closest to the canal, but hundreds more remained, stuck in homes they couldn't sell, on land nobody would buy, breathing air the government couldn't guarantee was safe. 2 years later, in 1980, Carter signed the bill that authorized the full evacuation and created what became known as the Superfund program, a federal initiative to clean up the most contaminated sites in the country. Love Canal was the reason that program exists. Hooker Chemical was never criminally charged. The executives who made the decision to sell that land, knowing what was in it, never spent a day in jail. Occidental Petroleum, which had acquired Hooker, eventually paid a settlement. But no one who made the decision that poisoned hundreds of families ever faced the consequences that those families did. The neighborhood was eventually cleaned up, they say, decontaminated, safe. Some of the outer sections were even reopened for new residents in the 1990s, rebranded under a new name, as if a different street sign could undo 20 years of poisoning. Some people moved in, some people still live there today. But former residents will tell you something that isn't in any official report, that when they go back, even decades later, something feels wrong. That the air in certain parts of that neighborhood has a quality to it that they can't describe to someone who wasn't there. That there are days, especially after rain, when the smell comes back, like it never really left. Like whatever was buried there is still, very slowly, making its way up. If this story got under your skin, welcome to the abyss. Subscribe for a new story every week. The ones history buried, the ones the powerful hoped you'd forget, the ones that are still down there, waiting to be found. Because the truth doesn't decompose, it just